late 80s, Square, also known as Squaresoft outside of Japan, created a series that would forever change the video game market and help popularize RPGs around the world. This series would of course be called Final Fantasy. These games would take players on epic adventures that blended unique stories, compelling battle systems, intriguing characters, and expansive exploration. Many people nowadays think Square's history begins with the Final Fantasy series. However, the company had been around for nearly half a decade before the first game ever saw the light of day. It's safe to say that the Square we know today, now named Square Enix, has found great success in the gaming industry and risen to become one of the largest video game publishers ever. This was not always the case though, as the Japanese company's earlier days were much more tumultuous before they finally found their golden chocobo, Final Fantasy. This is the story of a business that found success in the video game market, then nearly lost it before an RPG no one had ever heard of would save them from bankruptcy. This is Square's history before Final Fantasy. Our story begins not with a video game company, but instead with a power line contractor. Masafumi Miyamoto had just graduated from a prestigious college and was ready to finally set out and find his career. His father ran an electrical company named Den-Yu-Sha that built and installed power lines around various cities in Japan, but Miyamoto had very little interest in working in this particular field. Instead, he was driven by the prospect of cashing in on the rising popularity of computer games in Japan. After convincing his father of the gaming market's potential profitability, Miyamoto would persuade him to open a game development company as a subsidiary of Den-Yu-Sha, and in 1983, Square was born. Miyamoto was not very computer savvy in terms of developing software, but he was confident that he'd still be able to know how a good video game should be made. Around this time, many computer games were developed by a single person who would handle all of the programming, graphical, and audio work. PCs lacked much power back then, so this practice was much more feasible. Miyamoto wanted to break that trend though, as he saw how rapidly computers were evolving and would hire on a team of graphic designers and writers to create the company's first game, The Death Trap. Among these employees hired was Hironobu Sakaguchi, a college dropout that had just happened upon the job opening by chance looking for part-time work. Sakaguchi had been expected to only be doing clerical work, but he was quickly appointed as a producer and designer on Square's first software title. The Death Trap was a text-based adventure game that utilized its staff to create impressive still images for the time and craft an interesting story about a spy sent to Africa in an attempt to neutralize the threat of a biological weapon. It would be released in Japan in late 1984 for the NEC PC-88 home computer platform. The game wouldn't set the sales charts on fire, but was successful enough to warrant a sequel titled Will: The Death Trap 2. While working on the first Death Trap, Sakaguchi had met and gotten to know an aspiring musician that had been giving him demo reels in an attempt to find work. This musician's name was Nobuo Uematsu. Sakaguchi would eventually bring him on board to do some light music composition work for Death Trap's sequel as a third-party contractor. Will: The Death Trap 2 would be one of Japan's first titles to feature animated scenes and would inspire many titles that would later follow it. The game released the following year in 1985 and would find much more success than its predecessor, selling around 100,000 copies and being deemed a big financial success for the small company. Both Death Trap games had been notable for being graphically impressive and cutting edge for the time, a defining trait that Square would become known well for in the following decades. Shortly after Death Trap's sequel was released, Square would also create a port of Nihon Falcom's Dragon Slayer game for the MSX computer platform. The company had fully embraced the PC market while creating their first few titles, but they could not ignore the growing success of Nintendo's new Famicom game console, known overseas as the NES, which had already sold well over 1 million units by this point. Square jumped quickly into Famicom development and were the 7th third-party company to sign a contract with Nintendo to develop and sell Famicom software. Their first title for the game console was not their own though, as they would license and release a Famicom port of Game Arts' popular run-and-gun side-scroller, Dexter. Square would not abandon computer game development, however, and would release 2 new games the following year in 1986 for the PC-88, Cruise Chaser Blasty and Alpha. Cruise Chaser Blasty was a sci-fi RPG where the player controls a mecha suit and battles various enemies throughout space. Players could customize their mecha in various ways to give themselves an edge in combat. During development, Square would officially hire Nobuo Uematsu as their in-house music composer, making Cruise Chaser Blasty his first soundtrack as a Square employee. Uematsu would spend the next few years creating the music for almost every single title Square would subsequently develop. Blasty, the player's controllable mecha, would later make a cameo appearance as one of the bosses in Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward's Alexandria raid, and also receive a Motoroid series plastic model kit in 2020. Their second 1986 PC-88 title was Alpha, an interactive text adventure game similar to their earlier Death Trap series that used both still and animated graphic scenes. The player controls Chris, a young girl who awakens with amnesia aboard a spaceship called the Daedalus. This ship is transporting all of humanity to a new planet called Alpha after Earth's resources are completely drained. Chris works through the game to uncover the truth about herself as well as the Daedalus and Alpha. The title would be aimed at a more mature audience as it contained some risque scenes of Chris without her clothes on in compromised positions.
Oh my.
After Alpha, Square's PC software output would slow down, and the company would begin to shift its focus towards the now incredibly popular Famicom console. In September of 1986, Square had become successful enough to leave Denyu-sha and finally become its own independent company. It would rent out a new business suite in the Ginza district of Tokyo and promote many of its previously part-time employees, like Sakaguchi, to full-time. Square would also double down its efforts on producing software for the Famicom and its newly released Disk System add-on, churning out several titles for Nintendo's flourishing console over the course of the next few years. Its first original Famicom title, King's Knight, would also be its first game published as an independent company. King's Knight is a fairly standard vertical scrolling shooter designed by Sakaguchi that includes a few interesting twists on the genre. You play as 4 separate characters in the first 4 levels of the game, and must collect power-ups to level these characters up before attempting the final stage. In this last stage, you must control all of the characters at the same time and confront the game's final boss. Each of the different characters retain their boosted stats and levels you had gained in their earlier stages. The game would later receive a port to the MSX that same year, and then also see releases on the PC-88 and Sharp X1 PC platforms as King's Knight Special the following year. King's Knight is probably known better these days for its appearance in 2016's Final Fantasy XV as the mobile game the group of main protagonists all play throughout its story. It would even receive a playable mobile spin-off for iOS and Android devices in 2017, titled King's Knight: Wrath of the Dark Dragon, that garnered very little attention and was shut down within a year of its release. By this point, Square was seeing good profits from its software, and its gamble on the Famicom was paying off, even if the games had not exactly been up to the highest quality so far. It also formed a subsidiary group of various Japanese game developers to help produce and publish titles on the new Famicom Disk System called the Disk Original Group, often referred to as DOG or DOG. DOG included several Japanese game makers like Carrylab, Hummingbird Soft, and Microcabin. Following King's Knight, Square would develop 2 titles for the Famicom Disk System under this new DOG subsidiary, Suisho no Dragon, or Crystal Dragon, and Apple Town Story. Suisho no Dragon was yet another adventure game, but it differed from Square's previous adventure titles by utilizing point-and-click controls paired with visual icons to navigate and perform actions instead of the usual text-based commands. The science fiction-heavy story sees Hugh, the game's main character, and his girlfriend Cynthia traveling through space when they are suddenly attacked by a crystal dragon who abducts Cynthia. Man, I hate when that happens. Hugh must find this crystal dragon and save his kidnapped girlfriend. Appletown's story was simply a Japanese version of the 1985 life simulation game Little Computer People that had been first developed by David Crane, a game designer famous for his creation of the Pitfall series. Little Computer People is even in the game's subtitle and is comparable to a much more primitive version of The Sims. Appletown's story differs from Little Computer People by changing its playable character to a young girl, rearranging the house's layout, and simplifying the mechanics a bit. In 1987, Square continued its support for the Famicom Disk System and would release a new title called Tobidase Daisakusen. A few months prior, the company had hired a new programmer, but not one from Japan. This new employee was an Iranian-American named Nasir Jabali, who had had plenty of experience developing gaming software in the early 1980s before the video game crash bankrupted his company. Nasir, as he is often credited, had left the gaming industry for a while, but had become enamored with the Famicom and ended up meeting with Square's president, Musashi Miyamoto, through a mutual contact after having a desire to restart his programming career. Nasir utilized his expertise to create a new 3D scrolling effect technique for the Famicom that Tobidase Daisakusen would use, similar to Sega's 1985 arcade hit, Space Harrier. The game would be Square's first piece of software to make it to North American shores on the NES, and would be published by Acclaim under the title The 3D Battles of World Runner, or just 3D World Runner for short, which was its title on the box. While the game only saw modest success sales-wise, it would gain notoriety for being one of the first games to utilize a stereoscopic 3D effect, and came bundled with a pair of red and cyan lens 3D glasses. Pushing the select button while playing would change the game's graphics to 3D mode, where the included glasses could be worn by the player for an anaglyph 3D effect. Square would release a sequel to the game less than a year later titled JJ Tobidase Daisakusen Part 2. This sequel would never leave Japan, however. Around this time, Square's software output had grown immensely, but its profits were just not what they had seen earlier. The Famicom's massive growth and sales boom caused countless game companies, Square included, to push out smaller and lower quality titles to try and cash in on the hype. Consumers were beginning to wise up to this though, and their focus began shifting to bigger and more quality Famicom titles like Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda. This did not deter Square, however, as they would continue on with their current production model. They would return to PC platforms for their next two software releases in the summer of 1987, putting out Genesis Beyond the Revelation for the PC-88 and Aliens Alien 2 for the MSX. These would be the final two original games that Square would release on PC platforms for many decades. Genesis was a sci-fi strategy RPG set within a world devastated by nuclear war and destruction. Its battle encounters take place on a tile-based grid and play out in a semi-real-time combat system, while Aliens Alien 2 was a side-scrolling platformer based on the 1986 sequel to the hit film, Alien. It was a pretty short and straightforward game, but contained some very interesting music composed by the talented Nobuo Uematsu. By this point, Square's financial situation was starting to become dire, and it was forced to leave its more pricey business suite in Ginza and relocate to a cheaper office in Ueno, an old downtown area of Tokyo. The company not only had to relocate though, half of its staff were laid off, and Square was left with roughly only 30 employees remaining. Things were not looking good, but the company continued on. During the second half of the summer, they would release two more games for Nintendo's Famicom, Cleopatra no Maho and Highway Star. Cleopatra no Maho, or Cursed Treasure of Cleopatra, was an RPG played from a first-person perspective and had an interface similar to an adventure game. Players explored Egyptian towns and ruins, searching for the Tears of Isis, treasures once kept by the famous Cleopatra. The title was praised for its graphics and animations, but panned for how short it was and its lack of content. Highway Star would find much better success and utilize Nasir's 3D scrolling effect technique that had been seen previously in 3D World Runner. However, this game would not be a platforming shooter, but instead a racing title. North Americans are probably much more familiar with its overseas title, Rad Racer. Players could choose between a 328 twin turbo and an F1 machine to race opponents on a variety of courses and attempt to reach the finish line before time expired. Just like 3D World Runner, the game would come bundled with a pair of 3D red and cyan glasses and allowed players to switch to a special 3D mode while wearing them. The title was pretty successful sales-wise compared to many of Square's other games, but it unfortunately was not enough to right the ship, and the company continued to struggle to keep its head above water. Throughout the next few months, it became quite clear to Square that the company might not even survive to the end of the year. The staff would work on the aforementioned sequel to 3D World Runner while also co-developing a dating sim game with Nintendo called Nakayama Miho no Tokimeki High School, but it was clear that these would not be the life preservers that Square needed to stop its downward descent. Sakaguchi and his team knew this and began work on one final game to try and save the company from going under and plunging into the depths of defeat. Hironobu Sakaguchi had been very persistent about wanting to make a full-fledged RPG over the years, but his request had been constantly denied. While some of Square's titles are certainly considered RPGs, they lacked the scope and depth found within the type of RPG Sakaguchi wanted to make. He desired to create a game that felt like a long and epic journey. With the company's back against the wall and the role-playing game series Dragon Quest proving the genre was capable of being very successful, Square reluctantly gave in to Sakaguchi's request and allowed him to develop the game he had been clamoring to create for years. He immediately commenced planning on the project and started to build his team. Nasir Jabali would be assigned to handle the game's programming, and as usual, Nobuo Uematsu would be composing its massive soundtrack. Akitoshi Kawazu, who had previously helped work on Rad Racer, would design the game's battle system, taking heavy influence from the popular Dungeons & Dragons series. This influence helped set up the concept of enemies each having their own unique elemental weaknesses, a feature that would continue on throughout the franchise for years and years to come. Kawazu would later go on to create the Saga series for Square. After some convincing from his staff, Sakaguchi brought artist Yoshitaka Amano on board to handle the game's character designs and help illustrate the visual concept for its large fantasy world. Amano still to this day continues to create the logo design for each and every mainline Final Fantasy title. The scenario and script would be written by Kenji Terada, a writer known best for his work on the Kinnikuman and Dirty Pair anime series. Sakaguchi would work alongside him and assist in constructing the game's story. With all of the pieces in place, the team moved full speed into development and worked like their jobs depended on its success, because in reality, they did. It was obvious from the start that Square had very little faith in the game, as it was given a much smaller team than some of their other projects, but this doubt only served to motivate the group even more. This project was obviously important for saving Square's future, but it also had other implications unknown to the rest of the development team. Sakaguchi had determined that if this title did not sell well, he would quit the video game industry regardless of what happened with Square and return to finish college. After a long and arduous development process, the game finally reached completion. Its world was rich with many different environments and numerous types of races and creatures. It had impressive graphics, an engaging combat system, an expansive soundtrack, and told an epic story of good versus evil. The last thing it needed was a catchy title. Sakaguchi originally wanted to call it Fighting Fantasy, but a tabletop game with the same name already existed, so he had to rethink the words. He would later settle on Final Fantasy, a fitting name for the last attempt to save his struggling company from bankruptcy. In reality, though, Sakaguchi's main reasoning for the title was because this might be the final game he would ever create. Initially, Final Fantasy was only supposed to ship 200,000 copies, another indicator of Square's lack of faith in the game and also of how broke they were. But Sakaguchi pleaded with them to at least double the amount, as he was worried that a smaller shipment would not even give the game a chance to succeed in the market. He had been through thick and thin with the company for many years, and this had helped him plead his case. Eventually, Square gave in and doubled the shipment order to 400,000 units. Now it was time to wait. On December 18th, 1987, Japanese gamers would take control of the 4 Warriors of Light, and embark on a legendary adventure that would slowly take the world by storm. Final Fantasy was received well by critics and would go on to sell 600,000 units in Japan alone, getting Square back onto its feet so that it could continue to develop and publish its games. Though from now on, the company had a tentpole title that would continue to grow and become a worldwide sensation over the following years. Square would continue to grow in size as time moved on, making countless new franchises and taking their popular Final Fantasy series to new heights. Masafumi Miyamoto would step down as president of Square 4 years after Final Fantasy's 1987 release, but would still remain one of the company's key shareholders. Square would once more run into a dire financial situation in the early 2000s when its Final Fantasy motion picture, The Spirits Within, bombed at the box office. But just like before, they were able to bounce back and eventually merge with longtime rival game developer Enix. Sakaguchi, who had been the movie's director, stepped down from his position as an executive vice president and would finally make the decision to leave Square and form his own studio in 2004 called Mistwalker. He continues to still make video games to this day. Square's earlier games before Final Fantasy aren't incredibly captivating on their own, but when they are combined, they paint a very interesting story and show just how tumultuous yet intriguing Square's early history really was. Hey, appreciate you watching all the way to the end. This video was supposed to be a lot shorter. It was supposed to be like a 5 to 8 minute long video, and it turned into something much longer than that, obviously. I knew about a couple of Square's earlier titles, like Rad Racer and 3D World Runner, obviously the ones that came to the US, but I didn't realize there were so many other ones there. I wasn't familiar with their PC titles and their Famicom Disk System stuff as much. And I kind of walked into this thinking it was going to be kind of a quick and easy one to make, and it ended up being a giant iceberg because obviously just the tip was showing up, but there was so much underneath it that I just didn't know about. And it was very fascinating, and I learned a lot researching this one. It was really probably my favorite video to research so far, and probably the hardest one because these titles are just, you can only find little snippets of information about them because they're so old and there's just not a lot there. So it was a tough one to make. And it was a fun one to make as well. So I hope you got something out of this one. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a crazy one, and I hope to do more like this in the future. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.